this clinic at recording in progress. I want to welcome you all back to our Teaching Justice webinar series and our very first session of the 2022-23 school year. Today, we are really excited to present on the topic Teaching Justice through a Policy Advocacy Clinic. And our presenters that we're thrilled to have join us are Stephanie Campos and Rachel Wallace, both from Berkeley Law.
Hello, everyone. I'm Layla Halas. It's great to see you this fall semester. I'm a clinical professor of law at Tulane. I'm also the co-director of our Immigrant Rights Clinic. I'm a member, like Allison, of CLEA's Best Practices in Pedagogy Committee, which this is a project of. This is the Teaching Justice webinar series, the first kicking us off for this year. We're really excited. And as some of you know, this series features a number of innovative faculty members thinking about how kind of current social movements can inform our teaching and our thinking around justice. It draws wisdom from those social movements and looks at many different intersections. We've looked at immigration, we've looked at criminal justice, racial justice, economic justice, among many other issues. We are very excited about our lineup this year, today, of course, but also want you to keep in mind, next up, November 10th, we're going to have Priya Bhaskaran and Nicholas Miganelli presenting Critical Legal Research, Teaching Social Justice-Oriented Research in Clinics. In December 8th, we're going to have Rachel Lopez, along with Gani Songster and Rel Carter, presenting on Participatory Scholarship and Redeeming Justice. And we have this really great spring lineup that I'm just going to leave that kind of cliffhanger in the air, and you can check out our website. But we hope you stay tuned. That's where we're going to post our recording, and we'll put that information on how to register on the kind of CLEA website, as well as all of the usual listservs.
So you may have already received the indication that this session is recorded. As Layla mentioned, we're going to make it available on the CLEA website, and you can look back at the past 4 years of teaching justice. We are in our 5th year this year, and I know I go back and watch them frequently, so please do stay tuned to the website. We'll circulate that information via the listservs as well. We encourage interaction using the chat function. If you want to, you can ask a question or, raise an issue in real time. Layla and I and our presenters will be monitoring that. If you have a question during the session, we will have room for questions, but also feel free to put it in the chat. And we do ask that during the presentation, everyone please do mute their microphones, but you are most welcome to leave on your video if you're comfortable during the session. So with that, I will leave it to our presenters, and thanks again so much for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I see a lot of our Berkeley colleagues on the call too, so thank you for coming and joining us today. As the introducers mentioned, I'm Rachel Wallace, and I'm a clinical supervisor in the Policy Advocacy Clinic. And next slide, please. And then I also have Stephanie, who's with me from our clinic. Stephanie, do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Campos, and I'm an assistant clinical professor at Berkeley Law. I'm really grateful to be here with you, and yeah, excited to share more. Back to you, Rachel.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about teaching justice through a policy advocacy clinic. We're going to be talking about our work in what we call PAC at Berkeley Law, and kind of brainstorming some of the guiding questions that we have through our work with the group through the discussion and Q&A. So if you have questions, as was mentioned before, please put them in the chat, but we'll also have time at the end. But before we get into our content, we kind of want to know who's in the room. So we're going to do a poll everywhere. I'll also put the link in the chat right now. So if you click on the link in the chat, you'll be able to access 3 questions that just kind of ask about your clinical expertise and, where you're entering the space from. And then the results will populate on the screen once everyone votes. So if folks can just take a few minutes to do that, that would be great. I think it might be the next slide where it shows like the,
Yeah, I think I'm waiting for some people to finish answering all 3 questions, but yeah, feels like it's a race.
who can get the green line done quicker. And then we'll go through and look at the results from the 3 questions in just a moment once folks have participated.
All right, maybe we should just, as people continue to fill it out, it's supposed to go the next slide.
Cool. So we wanted to know what type of clinic do folks work in? So we see a lot of direct services clinics, about half, some folks from policy clinics as well. And then other, I think if you put other, I'd love to hear in the chat what kind of clinic you're working in. I'm just also really curious, and some litigation clinics as well. The next question was, how often does your clinic engage in policy advocacy? So just over a third of folks, it's not that often. So maybe this is new to a lot of people. And then I see, you know, about a quarter, or about a third actually combined is more than half of the time. And then the last question was, does your clinic represent or partner with community-based organizations? Yes, great. We love to see it. So it looks like folks are really engaged with the community, whether it's direct clients or coalitions, like when we work in policy space, we'll talk about a little bit later. And that leads me into kind of some of our guiding questions as well. So thanks for filling that out. And I'm seeing, yeah, Layla, you do multiple things. So maybe that's why you put other as well. So some of the guiding questions that we think about in our clinic that we'd also love to open for the discussion at the end of the presentation is, what should be the role of clinics and law schools in policy advocacy and policymaking? Often we're not, you know, directly, we do often have students who come, and even faculty who come from directly impacted communities, but we are a little bit separated being at law schools. So what is our role in that work? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to the community and impacted people, which is a relevant question for apparently everyone who works with community groups as well. So today's agenda, we are going to give an overview of our clinic to get a little bit of context about who we are and how we approach our work. We're going to talk about our seminar and discuss a sample class. I see Delaney is here, and Delaney taught this class. So shout out to Delaney for creating and the pedagogy and lesson plan for this class as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about our project structure and then go through a sample project, discuss some opportunities and challenges in our work as a policy advocacy clinic, and then do a Q&A and discussion coming back to some of those guiding questions. So I will turn it over to Stephanie to talk about what is PAC, what is our clinic, and what's the history of our clinic as well.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, we wanted to start a little bit by telling you about our clinic and what we do, kind of how we came to be. I think we're maybe one of the few clinics across the country that just focus on policy. So what does that look like in practice? So we're actually an interdisciplinary clinic where we try to utilize creative non-litigation strategies to address systemic racial, economic, and social injustice. Every year, we generally have about 30 to 40 students each semester. And again, because we're interdisciplinary, for us, that means trying to strike a balance of Juris Doctorate students and Masters in Public Policy students. Occasionally, we'll also have kind of Masters in Public Health, Urban Planning students, as well as some undergrads, but really try to rely on the expertise of kind of different students on campus here at Berkeley. Our students work together on teams to move forward clinic projects. And so the policy students help bring some of the key policy analysis skills, including around how do we define problems, how do we gather information and data, and how do we analyze that data. And then you have the law students who help bring critical reading, kind of fact development, and also kind of some problem solving skills. And the combination we've seen adds just tremendous value to the work that we're doing. And students have said that the ability to learn from and work with students from different disciplines is actually kind of one of the favorite parts about our clinic in particular. In terms of our faculty, we have 9 full-time faculty members in the clinic. 2 of us are tenure track faculty members, and 7 are essentially the equivalent of lecturers. But similar to our student makeup, we also try to strike a balance of both law and policy in the faculty. And so 5 of us are law trained and 4 are masters in public policy trained. We generally, as supervisors, co-supervise together our teams of students and projects. Occasionally, one of us will solo supervise, but I think we recognize the benefit of having both the MPP and JD together in supervising students and giving feedback on work product. And frankly, it also helps with coverage so that there's always kind of a backup or a second person in case someone's out sick or needs to step away from the work. We weren't always this big. 9 maybe feels like a lot for a clinic. I think in the past, we also focused on a variety of different things. We started off kind of doing consumer law, public benefits, and immigration, but more recently have settled into what we'll talk about a little bit later around monetary sanctions and some of the policy work there. But before we get to that, do you want to share kind of the history of the clinic, kind of how we came to be and got to the size that we were? Our clinic director, Jeff Selbin, who I think many of you know, started the Policy Advocacy Clinic actually out of the East Bay Community Law Center, which is Berkeley's community-based clinic and one of the largest provider of direct legal services here in Alameda County. Started back in 2012, kind of out of recognition that traditional means of lawyering through direct services and litigation were sometimes just really ill-fitting for addressing the systemic problems that so many of EBCLC's clients were facing. So how could we expect to achieve kind of different outcomes for clients when we were simply running into the same bad law over and over again? So the initial idea behind PAC was to pull out a set of students just to focus on the policy change. I think because when direct services was also a component of the work, students understandably had to focus on that because understandably the needs of clients who were in the waiting room were taking priority over going to the hearing in Sacramento or to the city council meeting in Oakland. And so in 2013, Jeff started with some pilot projects, kind of focusing on issues that were being surfaced by some of the direct services attorneys at EBCLC. I joined the clinic shortly after in 2014 when Jeff moved our clinic in-house at Berkeley Law. And we then had our first cohort of Masters in Public Policy students. And so at that time, we had 1 Masters in Public Policy student for every 2 law students. And we're trying to see kind of the mechanics of how that worked. Was this something that we could scale up? And I think the answers was yes, and we want to do more of it. So after working through some of the bureaucratic hurdles, which I don't want to underscore and say is a light thing, but I'm happy to talk about that if people have questions about how you work with schools across campus. We ended up being able to have our first semester of students in 2017, where we had the half law and half public policy, and brought on some additional fellows to support our growth. Around this time, we also were catching some attention in the eyes of national funders who I think both appreciated our model, the interdisciplinary approach, the focus on policy, and the particular work that we were doing at that time in California, which was trying to eliminate fees and fines for young people in the juvenile legal system. So in 2019 is when we really grew from a team of essentially 2 or 3 to then a team of 10. And so brought on folks like Rachel to really grow the group and expand our reach, both in terms of students and the work that we were able to do. That's a whole other conversation about what it means to grow to this size. And particularly, we did this during the pandemic. And so again, happy to chat with anyone who has questions about what it means to operate a clinic of this size and some of the lessons learned from that. But from the start, I think there are a couple of key principles that the clinic kind of developed and now adheres to in thinking about who we partner with and how we do our work. So client-driven, ground-up, and problem-based. So the clinic is client-driven in the sense that all of our projects are on behalf of clients. But for us, that usually means community-based organizations or coalitions. And so students still learn what it means to represent clients, but they're often organizational clients on kind of short-term and longer-term advocacy campaigns. So by setting up our projects as lawyer-client relationships, it helps hold us as the clinic accountable to the community, with students advising clients on the strategy, but ultimately the community group or the coalition defining the goals and making any decisions about the direction of the work. The second principle of the clinic is being ground up. And so by representing community-based organizations and coalitions, the clinic works on projects and issues that are ideally rooted in the lives of directly impacted people. And so it's community that's deciding what is pressing and important to work on, not legislators, not advocates, certainly not funders or us at the university. And I think this is a particularly important piece that we try to adhere to, because without community leadership, and at the very least buy-in, reforms can actually be really unsustainable and result in unintended consequences that can either have immediate ramifications or can threaten longer-term reform change. The last principle that the clinic adheres to is being problem-based. And so while our project work is tailored, our project work is tailored to kind of the issue at hand. And so students will work with clients on understanding the problem, kind of setting goals, and ultimately deciding on the solutions, but the solutions vary. And so legislation is definitely a key strategy that the clinic kind of utilizes, but it's not the only one. Sometimes our work requires a messaging campaign. Sometimes it's negotiating with system actors or kind of other combination of integrated advocacy efforts. And so all a way of saying that I think we try to tailor our tools to the particular issue at hand in order to achieve our clients' goals. So that's an overview of the clinic. Before I turn it over to Rachel to talk about kind of what actual projects we work on, I did want to touch base on kind of the seminar component of our clinic. So we have a seminar that is once a week for roughly about 2 hours. And we try to have a balance of kind of substantive law classes in terms of like what work we're doing. And so, for example, in working on fees and fines in the juvenile system, we have a class on the juvenile legal system and procedure. We also have some classes that are geared towards how we do our work, and so focused on skill development. So Rachel and I did a class on legislative drafting. We often teach students how to send and respond to Public Record Act requests. And then we have a set of classes that are focused on providing more backgrounds, histories, and kind of frameworks to think critically about our work and our role. And so, as Rachel mentioned, one example of a class that we do is one on abolitionism. And again, our colleagues, Jeff Selbin and Delaney Green, just taught this last week. So it's also really fresh in our mind and probably at least one of my favorite classes that we do every year. So we teach a class on abolitionism kind of midway through the semester. So our students have some familiarity with the substantive area that we're working in, as well as the particulars of their project in a given state. And so we frame the class as providing an introduction to kind of the origins and the concept of abolitionism, although many of our students are very familiar with the topic, but then consider how our work overlaps, intersects, and sometimes conflicts with current movements to contest, shrink, and abolish oppressive systems. So we kind of start off the class by just getting some shared knowledge and definition of what abolitionism means to students. So we use things like Jamboards or kind of virtual brainstorming tools to get people to share what they're thinking in an anonymous form. So it helps us get an understanding of kind of where students are at, but also allows students to kind of share their experiences and expertise, again, because so many students are coming with familiarity with particular subjects. We then do kind of a little bit of a lecture component in the sense that we talk about the origins of abolitionism, working through Frederick Douglass to Angela Davis, before talking about kind of the distinction between reformist reforms and more abolitionist reforms, and using Dorothy Roberts' kind of questions about whether reform will increase the possibility of freedom, shrink the state's capacity for violence, or end a badge or incident of slavery, to help guide the discussion about what is the work that we're doing and how does this fit into movements currently in place. And so after giving that background and context, we then get students to apply some of these questions in practice. So you'll see kind of on the picture here, Delaney kind of guiding the students through the exercise. But essentially, because so much of our work focuses on monetary sanctions this year, we break students into small groups and give them 10 different types of reforms that we commonly see when we're trying to address fees, fines in the system. And we ask students to organize them along a spectrum of what's a reformist reform to abolition. So to kind of zoom in, just to give you a sense of what this might look like in practice, we put up kind of two big pieces of paper on the wall showing reformist reform and abolition, and ask students to kind of lay out these 10 different types of reforms. Oh, someone can't hear. Is everybody else able to hear me okay? I don't know, maybe a thumbs up from people. Okay, all right. Yeah, okay. Well, I hope everyone can hear me, but maybe others in the chat can chime in. Since the majority, oh, sorry, excuse me. And so students are forced to grapple with, if we put a cap or a limit on a fee amount, is that kind of more reformist or more towards abolition than reimbursing families who were charged unlawfully? So again, this gives you a sense of kind of what we ask students to do. So it tests kind of students' understanding of key concepts and reforms on the particular subject matter that we're working in, but also I think helps preview conversations that they will inevitably have with their clients about bottom lines and walkaway points that they'll inevitably run into while they're moving forward reform and working through the legislative process. We then try to build on this exercise by getting students to reflect on where their particular project is along the spectrum. And so, for example, Rachel's team in Tennessee was kind of funnily just totally off the map and not even a reformist reform. And so just was illuminating to see kind of their experience of how they're seeing where the work is going. And then we also asked students to say, okay, if they had their choice, where they would draw the line about where their policy project would go. And so would they accept an ability to pay reform? Would they accept a partial repeal? Where would they draw that line? And I think it's always interesting to see students who I think identify as abolitionists struggle in figuring out exactly where they would draw the line or walk away, particularly knowing now kind of the details of their project, political feasibility in the state that they're working in, the stakeholders at the table, and where their client and coalition is already kind of leaning towards. So then we come back together as a full class to discuss some of the trade-offs in adopting reformist reforms and some of these abolitionist reforms, and also who gets to decide that. So that's kind of a very high level overview of one of the classes we do in the clinic. We'd be happy to share materials from this class if anyone is interested. And then last thing I'll say about kind of the seminar component is some of the assignments that we do in the class. So some of it is kind of self-reflection oriented, and I imagine many of you already do this, but they're kind of a series of memos at different points in the semester to help identify students' learning goals, help them reflect on what their progress is middle of the semester, and then kind of a end of semester reflection and check out. And so in addition to having students do these memos and turn them in, we also then meet one-on-one with students to discuss the content. The last kind of set of assignments that we do are more towards kind of applying skills in writing. So one of the first classes that we do early on in the semester to help kind of lay the groundwork for the work that we do is on kind of policy cycle and policy making. And particularly after that class, we assign what we call a policy mapping memo, where students have to identify the particular problem that their project is trying to address. What are the goals of their client? Is it to raise awareness about an issue? Is it to change hearts and minds? What exactly are they trying to do by the end of the semester? We also ask them to kind of map out who are the stakeholders. So who has an interest in the issue and what power or authority do they have to act? So it forces students to begin digging into existing work product and materials, but also helps us gauge early on kind of their writing style and comprehension. The last thing that we assign, which is new this semester, and I think we're evaluating how it went, is kind of a communications assignment. And so just knowing how often our clients ask students to develop external facing work product towards kind of different sets of audiences, we give students an option of either writing an op-ed, a fact sheet, or a talking points document to help translate what they've been learning into practice. So again, it helps us assess kind of comprehension, continue to give students feedback on their writing style, And yeah, so I think that kind of covers the seminar and some of the assignments that we do. But I know personally, the project work is also one of my favorite parts. And so I'm going to throw it back to Rachel to talk a little bit about some of the projects that we take on and a sample project in particular.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. So as Stephanie just mentioned, we have the seminar piece, but the bulk of clinic and the bulk of the hours that the students spend in clinic are on our project teams. And so we have team-based state teams that we have. And so our students rank at the beginning of the semester or like at the end of the summer, the states that they're interested in working in. I'll talk a little bit more about the national campaign in a minute and how we're in different states and we have partners in other states. But the students focus on one particular project, and we find that this allows them to really dive into the coalition that we're working with as our client, really like get an actual sense of the project and also get some ownership over the work because they're going really in depth into a particular issue in a particular jurisdiction. But we have multiple types, as Stephanie mentioned before. Legislation is certainly one avenue of change that we see in policy advocacy, but it's not the only one. And so our projects might, students might be focused on local advocacy or doing exploratory research in a particular state. So that's kind of some of the earlier stages of projects. We have a couple of projects that are more exploratory this year. The bulk of the projects are on state campaigns. So working either towards active legislation or working in the interim year in between sessions for legislative campaigns. And then national, we don't have a student team this semester on a national project, but I'll talk in a minute about what the national work looks like. So this is the national work. Our clinic is part of a national coalition called Debt Free Justice, or national campaign called Debt Free Justice. And we are on this campaign with Juvenile Law Center and the National Center for Youth Law as kind of the three main organizations. And this is a project which has the goal of eliminating fees and fines across the country. Ultimately, these fees and fines are assessed at the state level. And so we have to do state level campaigns. We can't just do like federal advocacy and get rid of them all. So we've split up the states across the three organizations. And because our clinic has a large number of students and faculty, we have a large number of states. And so currently, I believe we have 13 projects in like 11 states or something like that this year that we're working on. And you can see some of the progress that's been made in the national campaign and our clinic's role in that work. So 20 states and 9 localities have repealed one or more youth fees and or fines. And just in the last 2 years, so 2021 and 22, 27 states considered 31 bills to repeal youth fees and fines. So it's getting a lot of traction, and our students have really been a huge driver for this work as well. So I will, before I get into a sample project, I'll kind of just back up just to talk a little bit more about the client, because I realized I didn't really talk about the coalitions that we have. Stephanie mentioned it a little bit earlier, but on these project teams, students are representing clients. We have retainers and kind of classic client relationships, but oftentimes these will be coalitions. And so some of the students' work is actually coalition management. And that's a skill that we think is unique in kind of the policy space because there need to be a lot of different people at the table versus in litigation, coalitions might not be kind of the natural fit for a client. And so sometimes these will be advocacy organizations, community-based organizations. Typically, in states that are not California, and even in California, there's a contract lobbyist, but it's important that in the states that are not California, that person is in the state that the bill is actually moving in. They can go to the Capitol and do things that we can't. It's also worth noting that in some places, our role is very behind the scenes because, some certain stakeholders in different states might be sensitive to national organizations and law schools coming in and, wanting to work on policies in the states where they're not located. And so we often ghostwrite materials for a lot of folks and provide technical support and technical assistance. And so we've scaled up to the national campaign by providing technical support. That's really the role of the three organizations in the campaign. And something to mention with all of those states is that we've seen really a range of political environments. And that's really been something that has, as you can see on the map again, we're working in places I work in the South, so I work in places like Arkansas, Tennessee, Georgia, where, abolishing things can be challenging, particularly abolishing, and talking about, like race and talking about wealth extraction are not really concepts that are sometimes well received in those legislatures. And even in some of the more progressive states, we still also, face challenging political environments. That's something that our students also have to grapple with. But I'll get into a sample project now. I've talked a lot about fees and fines, and that really is kind of our flagship project for the past several years in our clinic, but something that has been new, this is the first year we've had a restitution team. And I think this is a really good example of letting the community partners that we work with really dictate their priorities. We hear in all the states we work, families get a bill and in the mail, or they're handed a bill in court, and it doesn't really matter to them if it's a fine, a fee, or a restitution that they owe. All they know is that they owe money. And so we've made a distinction for generally political reasons between fines, fees, and restitution. And they're legally different as well. But we've made that distinction in policy work in order to break up bills into feasible legislation. But ultimately to the community, there is really no distinction. And so we've started venturing into the restitution space in a couple of teams, and namely on the California team. Also, just because that team has been up and running for several years and has already seen a lot of success. We didn't talk about the California bills that have passed, but we just had a retreat on Friday, and there was something like $16 billion of debt that coalition has had relieved in the last few years. So they're a little further along in the campaigns. And so we now have capacity and a political moment to start talking about restitution. So what does it look like? First, we start with coalition building and management. We had a Debt-Free Justice California coalition that we then split into a restitution subgroup. So we didn't have to start from scratch. In a lot of states, we do 1 million phone calls with different community organizations to see who's interested in being on a coalition. But here we had a subgroup that was formed out of the existing coalition that had worked on fees and fines. The next step of our projects is generally exploratory work. So doing research, we might, in California, we've been able to support and supervise a couple of Master of Public Policy student graduate thesis reports on some of the work that we're hoping to do in future sessions, so that we have data analysis and recommendations from those reports. But in places where we're not doing those projects, it might be interviews with folks, public record act requests is a big one, other ways of gathering data. So surveying individuals and really trying to understand the scope of the problem and the specific statutes that would need to be addressed by a bill. Then we set our policy priorities in the fees and fines space. This is pretty straightforward because the priority is to repeal them. But in restitution, it's been a little bit more challenging because there's like 10,000 things we could do. And so to make restitution less harmful for people who have to pay it, and also to make sure that victim compensation is robust. And so we just had a retreat on Friday where we set some policy priorities with the coalition. And then we move into actual legislative advocacy. So that starts with bill drafting, and students have a big role in bill drafting, and then working directly with the lobbyists. Creating materials is another student assignment that's pretty common, as Stephanie mentioned, with like the op-ed and fact sheets and talking points. And then implementation work. So we feel really strongly that we shouldn't just advocate for legislation to pass and then walk away. Oftentimes, some of the hardest work is making sure that people actually follow the new law if you get it signed. And so we might send records requests to courts to see if they're complying. With one of the bills that passed from the California restitution team in this past year, it removes unpaid restitution as a barrier to record relief. And so what the implementation looks like for that is making sure that the community knows their rights under the new law and knows that they're able to repetition for record relief if they were previously denied for unpaid restitution, and then connecting them to legal service providers that can help them do that. So that's some of our implementation work. And then the piece with 1 million arrows is really serving impacted communities. And we do this at every stage that we can. In California, we've done multiple different surveys. one, a couple during the research stage, one recently with setting policy priorities. We'll probably do more as we get further along with our bills for this next session, but making sure that their priorities are heard and that also organizations that represent impacted communities are at the table when we make decisions. So that's our example project. I'll turn it back to Stephanie to talk about some of the opportunities and challenges, and then I'll come back for the discussion.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. So yeah, I think this work is really exciting and offers a lot of opportunities, but there's also some challenges in doing this type of work. So just wanted to run through some of the things that we've seen over the years. Opportunities, I think, having students have access to policymaking spaces and the type of skill development is really important. As Rachel mentioned, because we work at the local, state, and national level, it gives students kind of different lenses into ways in which they can be occupying certain spaces, whether they're going to be a lawyer or a policy advocate down the line, and helps them gain insight into different steps in the policymaking process. I think one of the things that we always hear from students is they just didn't have an appreciation for all the steps involved, what it takes to introduce a bill, and all the things that might stem from that. And so it really, I think, gives students a hands-on experience of what it means to move forward legislation at the local or state level, and sometimes national. I think, again, as we were mentioning throughout today's presentation, kind of a unique set of skills that students gain through doing PAC. I think one just being it's an alternative to direct services and litigation. I think a lot of courses and clinics in law school are geared towards that because, again, I think a lot of students go in that direction eventually. But I think more and more we see students who are interested in either doing solely policy work or at least having that as being a component of their work down the line. And so having an opportunity for students to join a clinic where that's kind of the bread and butter of what we do, I think is a really important offering to have at the law school. I think it's also one of the things that I think translates whatever students end up wanting to do is having to take the law or particularly technical issues and translate that into different forms of work product. So fact sheets, a bill, op-ed, whatever it may be, social media, and also to different audiences. So how does what you share about restitution change when you're talking to a judge versus an advocate versus an impacted person? And so students get some appreciation for having to tailor that kind of the message and the form depending on the goal and the audience. The last piece is, I think it's an opportunity to think about and participate in movement lawyering. And so, as Rachel mentioned, I think, we do a lot of coalition and client management. And so students get to be kind of a participant in that, but also gain skills in facilitation, particularly around hard decisions. A lot of things that we're working through are tough to say, like, hey, we're gonna either end fees or we're not going to reimburse families. And how do you make that decision knowing that impacted people or advocates are going to be, harmed or not harmed in a particular way? And then also, I think one of the things that we try to really focus on here, I think amongst the clinical program at the law school here, is just how do we move forward systemic change in partnership with community, and what are the challenges of doing that? And so getting students to have that experience early on in their careers, again, since so many of them, I think, are wanting to evaluate whether or not that's a job opportunity they want to pursue down the line. In terms of some of the challenges, I think it's related to some of the opportunities, but what is the role of a law school clinic in policymaking and policy advocacy, particularly in states where we're not located in? It can be hard coming in as Berkeley. And so having to, maybe take a step back or work with students on understanding, we can't be the face of this, and here's the reason why, is both, I think, an opportunity and a challenge. And also just acknowledging our role as a fairly well-resourced university amongst advocacy organizations, community-based organizations, and trying to navigate that with students can be challenging at times. The other thing, which I'm sure is true for many of your clinics and work, is this is not a simulation. So the idea that you can do this from November to December, and there's a clear deadline. Oftentimes we have to readjust based on what the client needs, or sometimes the client is busy or absent and we don't get the direction that we want, let alone legislative cycles obviously do not match up with the semester schedule. And so trying to map that onto student learning goals, with kind of deadlines is also something that we're constantly trying to figure out. I think the other piece, which is maybe more relevant for some of our law students, is because we're doing novel work, there's often no sample or model, which I think they often want to see or have. And so it can be a challenge to get students to get out of their comfort zone and try something new. And the last thing, as you'll see, is both the opportunity and the challenge. But and one of the questions that I think we're hoping to discuss with you all is, what is our role as lawyers, law students, as the university, in movement lawyering broadly, but also in policymaking spaces? Should we be in that? Should we be doing this work? Should we not? If we are, what are some of the parameters we should set for ourselves, or how do we hold ourselves accountable? And then the last one is adhering to our clinic principles. And so we mentioned the three kind of principles being problem-based, ground up, and client-driven. But I'll admit that it's hard to maintain those in practice all the time. And so that's something that we're constantly asking ourselves every semester is about how we're doing and what we can be doing better. But yeah, hoping to chat more with you all about that. And so I will turn it back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Stephanie, for going through some of the opportunities and challenges. I imagine that those are similar, as you mentioned, to many of the people on the call. So for the discussion, we'd love to hear from folks on your thoughts on the role of clinics and law schools in policy advocacy or policy making. And then, I noticed 100% of people work with community organizations. So how do we hold ourselves accountable to the community and impacted people? And one thing we grapple with in policy work is how do we balance community priorities with advocacy priorities and political feasibility if they conflict. So we'd love to hear folks' thoughts on that. I will also take questions at the same time. So it'll be kind of a discussion Q&A mixed together for the remainder of the time. I can start with the first question that I saw already. Can you talk more about surveys, resources, and strategies? Yeah, we can talk a little bit about some of the surveys that we typically do are to stakeholders. So for example, we might do a survey to public defenders in a particular state, or to judges or clerks. We also will often survey impacted people to get stories, to kind of illuminate the issue or to identify people for testimony. In terms of resources, there's the time question. So this is where our students' hours really are helpful because they can really spend a lot of time creating, administering, usually in the consultation with a community partner who has relationships in the community to administer the survey, and then also analyzing the results. So that's how we work within the constraint of capacity. In terms of financial resources, we generally compensate folks for impacted community member surveys, in particular, generally not with stakeholder surveys, but with impacted surveys, we try to compensate folks for their participation in some way. And we have some funding for that through some of the grant money that we receive to do this work. And oftentimes other organizations will be able to financially support. And yeah, strategies, we found, the one thing I'll say, and then if you have a clarifying question, I'd be happy to answer it, is we found that surveys are actually really helpful. Oftentimes more helpful than public records requests, which in some states we just don't see a lot of traction with, whether people just aren't complying with Public Records Act laws or like the equivalent in their states. We're seeing that in some of our places in the South now, or they just don't maintain aggregate data. So the data we're asking for, they don't maintain it. So the surveys can be a good way for people to respond. And oftentimes the public defenders know a lot. So it's really helpful to engage with them. But if you have a follow-up question, I'd be happy to answer it.
I think maybe one thing I'm hearing from that question too is our messy arrow slide of like constantly going back to the community. And so for that project, for example, one of the things that we did was kind of reflect on what that coalition had accomplished in the last couple of years, what was left to be done, and what were some of the new issues that we were starting to hear, and surveyed impacted people of what would they prioritized in the next legislative session. And so got that input there. We also then, if push comes to shove and there's an amendment that has to be taken and there's a decision to be made, we often survey impacted people. Okay, if the choice is this or this, what would you go for? Give them the information on kind of what the decision is, what are the pros and cons, and then kind of at the implementation stage, assuming a bill has passed, checking in about what relief they've seen, what are some of the pressing issues they're still seeing, to be able to kind of have that feedback loop that will inform, again, what we work on next year. And so I think it's just being kind of like a conscious effort of what are the points in which we should be getting impacted communities' input, and what are the ways in which we should be doing that, focusing on access. Like Rachel said, I think compensating people can be really helpful. Sometimes it's, setting aside a time and doing a focus group because it's easier for people to participate in that way. But it depends also, again, on the particular coalition or the issue that you're working on.
Thanks, Stephanie. Any questions or if folks have thoughts on the kind of discussion prompts on the slide in your work or questions about our work here? Feel free to do the hand raise function or the chat, whichever folks are more comfortable with. Yeah, Jay.
Hi. I wanted to know, this almost seems like not only do you need partners, but you also need issues that are derived from the community. How do you connect with the community to find out what the issues are that are important to them to then get the resources that you need from the law school? And then secondly, how do you get the law school to, at least in where I'm at UB, how do you get the law school to then commit to those resources that are necessary to, talk to the other schools within the university to build a coalition with them and facilitation and to get surveys and people who are professionals in that area to help with the sort of the legal or lobbying part or advocacy part in the other area? And I'll take my answer, I'll mute myself.
Yeah, I can maybe start with, how do you get in touch with impacted community? I think it varies in California because we have relationships and we know folks, it's a little bit easier, but I think in some of the other states where we're obviously not residents and don't know the field, oftentimes the first thing that we're doing on a project is just doing kind of like listening sessions almost or one-on-ones. And so reaching out and saying, here's kind of the work that we do. We're interested in hearing more about the issues that you're seeing and kind of generating it in that way. And so a lot of that kind of frankly takes a lot of time. And, ideally we'd have more time to do it. But I think a lot of it is just trying to make sure that you're building trusted relationships in the community. I think a lot of community members understandably can see universities or advocacy groups as kind of being extractive sometimes. So also I think it's helpful to be transparent and acknowledge about what are the parameters of what we can do and what we can't do. And so, I think a lot of it is just setting up calls, ideally, to the extent that you can go to the state, meet people, show that you're not just trying to take an idea and run with it, can be really helpful. But to be honest too, it's a struggle for us, particularly working in other states and something that we're reflecting on kind of longer term of what's our value add here in California, but also kind of in other states. On the funding piece. Oh,
can I add to that piece before you move to the second part of the question? It can be super random how we engage with groups sometimes. Like in Tennessee, it started because I was listening to a podcast that a judge was talking on. And I was like, I think she would agree with our policy issue. So we just sent her an email and we're like, do you agree with our this issue that we have expertise on? Do you want to work on it? And then we worked with her court on a policy and now there's a state bill. So it can really just be straight cold emailing, like Stephanie said, but trying to identify people who maybe they've done other work in similar spaces that we think would have overlap with our issue work. But that was just a random story of how we got engaged with folks and it worked okay. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funding piece is probably more complicated and up to the whims of your particular way your law school funds the clinical program and your work. I think we have some benefit of a couple of our faculty members are kind of hard funded by the law school. And so there's some stability there and some recognition that there are some key pieces in order to operate the clinic. Kind of the additional people power that we have is frankly from national funders, and we've been explicit with them about it's not just doing this work, but making sure that we're compensating community-based organizations and advocacy organizations who want to do this. And so the national campaign, for instance, that Rachel mentioned, there's a specific fund that the funders have set aside a fairly sizable chunk of money so that if the community-based partner in Tennessee wants to work on this, it's not a matter of how do we figure this out given existing staffing, but they can apply for funding to be able to participate in a way that is meaningful to them. So that's, a funding conversation, but I think important also to underscore for funders that it's an important piece of the work, and that if we don't involve community at every level, we're going to come up with reforms that are going to be unsustainable, and we'll be back in the same place just a few years later. So.
I'm seeing a question in the chat that I can start to answer, and then maybe Stephanie, you can add. So how to create direct lines to directly impacted people for students. They feel like they're making a difference even when we have such long timelines. And so I can talk about some of the ways that we've, created opportunities for students to engage with the community. So in Tennessee, and oftentimes it has to do with travel in the states that are not California, because we find that it's easier for students to be invested in the project if they're on the ground. And so last year we were able to travel to Tennessee, and students conceptualized and facilitated 2 focus groups with young people in Nashville and Memphis on the issue. And they really had a lot of ownership over this process. They connected with identified community organizations who could host just all the logistics, but also just prepping, each other, they prepped us really for how to participate. Like, we didn't prep them on how to participate, and making sure that the community organizations could identify the right youth to attend. So that was a really meaningful experience. I see Anna Victoria on the call, they were just sharing about a trip they had to Illinois this past week, where they spoke at a community event and a student presented on their issue, and they got feedback from the community and support, and secured, a lot of support for their campaign there. So those are some of the examples of how we get them involved. In instances where travel is not possible, it's oftentimes just making sure that if we identify a student who is like really interested in community work. So like on my current Tennessee team, I have a student like that. And they were like, this is what I want to do. And so we're probably not going to travel to Tennessee this semester, but they're going to help put together a Zoom kind of update call for community organizations alongside one of our advocacy partners. And the student has a lot of ownership over doing that as well. So those are things that we can do that, even along a long timeline, can be really impactful and useful for the work, but also for student development. So those are just a couple of ideas. They can also help with, I had a student who in Arkansas, for example, where I'm working, we're not going to be doing direct organizing on the ground there because the political environment's a little bit different there. There's a lot of distrust skepticism around outsiders and national advocacy, as I mentioned before. So the student's role was to help a community organization hire an organizer. So one of their deliverables was to draft a job posting and a scope of work for a community organizer that reflects the issues that we want the organizer to be able to identify in the community, even though the student's not going to be the one who actually does it, and creating a survey for impacted communities that organizer can then distribute in the community. And so helping to manage the organizer's role has been another student project this semester. But I don't know, Stephanie, if you have other examples or want to add anything.
I think the only thing I'd add is being transparent about the timeline in the process. I think sometimes it's easy, and I say this because I do it, of just like, okay, we're at the next phase of the project and we're starting and here's your things that you have to do. But I think giving them a sense of like, here's where the project started, here are all the students who worked on this before you, and kind of the ups and downs that came before it, kind of getting them invested in the history of the work and who's at the table can be really helpful. And then, like Rachel said, I think things related to testimony, doing like press releases, media statements, although the students may not necessarily end up being the face of that, I think they definitely feel some pride in seeing their work, being the thing that the senator from Arizona, writes an op-ed, but we know that, the student really helped draft that piece for them and guide them in the talking points. And so even though it may not be public facing, I think just celebrating with the students some of those wins or recognizing the work that they're doing, even though it may feel small sometimes, is really important.
I think we have time for maybe like one more question if anyone has anything, and then we'll probably wrap up from there. So I don't know if there's a final question. Or we can wrap up now, which means everyone gets out on time. So we put our contact info on this slide. We're also on social media. So if you want to follow what we're doing, feel free to follow us if you're interested in our clinic's work, Instagram and Twitter. But yeah, thank you so much for all of your attention and time today coming to this presentation. If you have questions for us, please do reach out. We would love to hear from you, and especially if folks are interested in starting a policy clinic or expanding a litigation clinic into policy work, we're happy to talk with folks about ways to do that and strategies we've learned along the way. So thank you to Allison and Layla as well. And I'll turn it over to y'all to close.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Rachel. You've really given us so much to think about, and this has been such a dynamic and interesting and exciting way to launch our series for the school year. So really huge thanks to you both for all the work that you do and for sharing it with us today. Everyone who joined us, thank you so much. It's great to see all of you. We will post the recording shortly to the CLEA website. And we hope that you'll join us again in November for critical research, and then in December for participatory scholarship, both which I think will build really nicely on the presentation we saw today. So best wishes, everybody, for the rest of the week, and see you very soon.
Thank you.